Over in East Asia, meanwhile, a civil war had been going on in China for quite some time between nationalists and communists, which is kind of similar to what happened in Spain in the 1930s. Now, as you're no doubt aware, China had been an empire for a very long time, thousands of years, but the Chinese Empire had ended, and the last emperor had been deposed in 1912, and then China became a republic, the Republic of China. In 1927, the Chinese Communist Party started a revolution to try to overthrow the government of the Republic of China. So those are the nationalists. The fighting went on for about 10 years, with the nationalists having the advantage, having the upper hand. They had more troops, and the troops were better trained. But then they sort of took a break from fighting one another in 1937, because, as you'll recall, all of a sudden they had someone new to fight, that is, the Japanese. So the Civil War was pretty well suspended throughout China's involvement in World War II from 1937 to 1945. Then, however, once Japan was out of the picture, the Civil War started back up. And when it started back up in 1945, this time the nationalist advantage had kind of frayed a little bit, because during the war, both sides had been fighting against the Japanese, but they hadn't been fighting really in unison. Each of them separately was fighting against the Japanese in the areas where they controlled the territory. And most of that fighting had been in the areas controlled by the nationalists. Most of the communist control areas were in the northwest. So the nationalists took a lot more casualties than the communists did against the Japanese. And their highly trained soldiers, well, most of them got killed fighting the Japanese either in China or in Burma. So that kind of evened things out quite a bit. And then once the war is over, World War II that is, the Soviet Union started supporting the communists, sort of by proxy, with material, ammunition, various kinds of support. And as that's happening, the United States, who had been supporting the Chinese fight against Japan, the U.S. continues their support of the official government, the Republic of China, that is the nationalists. So that's also kind of like what happened in Spain, where you had Germany supporting one side and the Soviets supporting the other. This time it's America supporting one side and the Soviets supporting the other. However, as the fighting continued, the communists got a better and better advantage. Now, for all this time, since 1927, the leader of the nationalists had been the guy there on the upper right, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese National Party of the Kuomintang, and we'll have a slide next to show you how to spell all these things. And then the leader of the Communist Party, Chairman Mao Zedong, who is up there in the upper left. Now, as you can see on the map, the dark purple, purplish, not really sure what color that is, but that's what the communists controlled at the very end of the war. And then they start taking more and more territory, then more and more, so that by 1949, the nationalists are there in southeastern China, and they suffered a really big military defeat in August of 1949, and they retreated to the island of Taiwan and maintained control of Taiwan and a few tiny little islands near there. And that was about 600,000 nationalist soldiers and about 2 million civilian refugees made their way to the island of Taiwan, and they were able to hold out there. So that's all that was left of their holdings that had once been the entire country. Well, when that happened, on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong announced at Tiananmen Square in Beijing that the new government was the People's Republic of China. Now, over in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist followers still considered themselves to be the Republic of China. They considered themselves to be the same government that had been in charge since 1912. So they're down there in Taiwan, but there's not a whole lot that they can do against the whole rest of China. And that is still the situation today. Taiwan is an autonomous, independent country that calls itself the Republic of China. It was ruled by Chiang Kai-shek until his death in 1975. It is, however, not recognized by the government of the People's Republic of China, which most of the rest of the world calls China. So they don't recognize Taiwan as being independent. They have a one China policy, which is to say they consider Taiwan to be part of China, whether they're controlling it at the moment or not. They don't recognize it, and any country in the world that wants to be on the good side of China also doesn't officially recognize Taiwan or the Republic of China, because the People's Republic of China is very, very touchy about that, which is why I don't know if you were paying attention or if you understood what was going on when Trump first got elected, not long after his inauguration. He accepted a congratulatory phone call from the president of Taiwan, the Republic of China, and then China got furious, and it was a huge international scandal that I don't think Trump understood why it was such a big deal, because he didn't, I'm assuming, know any of this history, nor did he know that the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China are two different things. Anyway, here's how you spell all that stuff. Mao Zedong, you are likely to see various spellings of his name. Sometimes you see the one on the right, and that is pronounced Mao Zedong. Sometimes you see the one on the left, and that is pronounced Mao Zedong. It's really just two different styles of transliterating Chinese into English. The one on the right is the older British style. The one on the left is the style that the Chinese government prefers. All right, well, the Soviet Union had been helping the Communist Party in China during the revolution. Once they actually win the revolution, Chairman Mao goes to Moscow to meet with Stalin, who keeps him waiting, kind of insults him by doing that. The two of them don't like each other very much at all. But they, starting in 1950, have an alliance of sorts that pretty quickly starts to get strained during the upcoming Korean War. And by about 1960-61, the Chinese and the Russians are just totally on completely different pages. In fact, they start to compete with one another. Remember, there was that struggle for hearts and minds between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. Well, in the Eastern Bloc, you've got the Chinese and the Russians sometimes trying to get the same communist parties, the same countries, to come over to their part of the communist side. And it even led to some sporadic fighting along the border between the Russians and the Chinese eventually. So by the early 60s, not only were they on kind of different trajectories, they were practically enemies. And again, that's something that most Westerners, most Americans in particular, had no real clue about, even though it wasn't a secret, because they just equated all communists as being the same thing. By the way, I mentioned that Chiang Kai-shek was in charge in Taiwan until he died in 1975. Chairman Mao Zedong, was in charge in China until he died in 1976. By the way, I forgot to include the People's Republic of Mongolia earlier when I listed those various non-Warsaw Pact communist countries. So with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and of course with Mongolia also being a communist country, but especially with China because it's a really big country, once that happened, Japan became much, much more important to the West because it's right there near China. They certainly didn't want Japan also to become a communist country, and so this was the point at which they started investing a lot of money in rebuilding Japan and wooing Japan as an ally of the United States to be part of the Western Bloc. And this is going to be very important, particularly in the years right after all this happened, as the 1950s start, and there's a war in Korea. And so this guy comes back into the story. General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Allied Commander in Japan, who essentially, since 1945, had been running Japan and had supervised the drafting of the new Constitution of Japan. He was nicknamed by the Japanese the Gaijin Shogun, that is the foreigner shogun, which essentially is what he was, the military commander, supreme military commander of the country. However, 1949, he hands control of Japan back over to the Japanese, to the newly established, brand new Japanese government, who are now going to be allies of the United States, part of the Western Bloc. And MacArthur will still remain in Japan for a couple of years until President Truman kind of calls him out to send him just over the water a little bit to the Korean Peninsula, where some mighty big things were happening. At the end of World War II, Korea, which is there, surprisingly, on the Korean Peninsula, which had been occupied by Japan, actually for a couple of decades even before the war, was liberated from Japanese control. And just like had happened in Germany and other places, it was divided into zones, with the Soviets occupying the northern half and the Americans occupying the southern half. By 1948, they had agreed on the 38th parallel as the border between the two zones. Not long after that, new governments were set up in each of the two halves of Korea, which for a long time before it was taken over by Japan, had been an independent kingdom. However, now it is divided in half, North Korea and South Korea, with each government, communist government in the north, each government refusing to recognize the other, and each one saying that they alone are the true legitimate government of Korea and should have the whole thing. Well, in June of 1950, North Korea acted on that by advancing beyond the 38th parallel down into South Korea. They came down and invaded South Korea. Well, what to do? This whole thing had been set up by the newly established United Nations. And as you'll recall, when we talked about the establishment of the UN, the hope was they would be more effective than the League of Nations. They would actually have some teeth, as it were, to enforce their decisions. So the UN set up what was called the United Nations Command, a police force, a military police force, really a big army, whose job was to get the North Koreans out of South Korea and back into their appropriate zone as had been decided at the end of the war. Well, this police action, the UN command, was composed of troops from 21 nations, but 90% of those troops were from the United States. So the troops came and started fighting with alongside the South Koreans against the North Koreans in the northern part of South Korea to try to drive them back across the 38th parallel. It didn't take long for them to do that. A couple of months of fighting, and they had pushed the North Koreans. And again, well, not again, I'm just letting you know that it was actually General Douglas MacArthur who was put in charge of the UN forces, which was mostly American. So MacArthur's forces pushed the North Koreans back up into North Korea, and they just kept pushing, actually. Those forces and their South Korean allies advanced deep into North Korea, all the way up there toward North Korea, toward the border with China, with the goal being not just to get the North Koreans out of South Korea, but just kind of put a stop to this tomfoolery, I guess you could say. At least that was MacArthur's plan. And by October, this was the situation. By October 19th, I think it was. Let's see. Yeah, well, within a couple of weeks, Chinese troops came into North Korea to support the North Koreans. About 300,000 Chinese troops, although the UN forces did not know at that time there were that many of them. MacArthur didn't take them real seriously. He thought that there were far fewer than there actually were. And he pretty well had the opinion that, yeah, if we're fighting this war, let's go ahead and win it. Let's just subjugate North Korea. And if China wants to play, we'll go ahead and subjugate them too, which was problematic because China had not broken with the Soviet Union yet. They had just signed that sort of uneasy alliance earlier that year. And in fact, Chairman Mao committed his troops. He was trying to convince Stalin to provide air support, which Stalin sort of hesitated on doing, but eventually did do. So there was this fear that if MacArthur had his way, and his way was, let's just go ahead and take all of North Korea, and while we're at it, let's just go to China. That would lead to war not only with China, but also with the Soviet Union, which now has atomic bombs. Also, this was not a traditional war, like World War II, for example, was, where the United States Congress declared war on another country. This was a police action administered by the United Nations, and the goal wasn't to win a war. The goal was to get the North Koreans out of South Korea back into North Korea where they're supposed to be. So President Truman did not want to greenlight MacArthur's plans to go ahead and just, essentially fight everybody. And MacArthur wasn't very pleased with that. In fact, he made several public statements to the effect that he was going to go ahead and attack China. He made some private statements that were intercepted and also some public statements to the press after the president had expressly said to the nation, that is not what we're going to do. We're going to withdraw below the 38th parallel. So MacArthur, I think MacArthur had gotten used to being in charge of everything, really. He was in charge of the entire Allied military force fighting against Japan, and then he was in charge of the entire country of Japan. And I think it maybe went to his head a little bit, but he was pretty open about disobeying the president, essentially. And so Truman fired him. He fired him despite the fact that MacArthur was extremely popular, and Truman's popularity, we'll talk about him more later. He had barely won re-election, and his popularity is starting to waver by this point. But he did, in fact, fire MacArthur, and eventually the UN forces did get back down there below that parallel and into South Korea. President Truman later said this about his firing of General MacArthur, and I'm going to use my Truman voice. I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was. But that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to three-quarters of them would be in jail. So, MacArthur's fired, and by the summer of 1953, the fighting is over, and things had returned to the status quo, where they still remain, actually. This conflict never really officially ended. That's why there's still a lot of tension along that 38th parallel, along that border between North and South Korea. The actual fighting part of the war lasted for 3 years and 1 month, although there were little skirmishes along that border here and there down through the years. This is just a side note. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the classic television show MASH that was on in the 70s and 80s. A MASH unit is a mobile army surgical hospital. The show was based on a popular movie, which in turn was based on a very popular novel that had been written by a former MASH unit doctor. Anyway, the war lasted for 3 years, but the show was on for 11 years. I've always taken that as kind of evidence that if you watch the whole thing and are aware it's supposed to take place over a 3-year period, war really does age people.